Christ promised that his coming would be at the time of the destruction of the temple at Jerusalem and in the apostles' generation. See, so you see, this adds up. This is conforming or falling in line or is in harmony with what Daniel said. Okay, because remember, Daniel is a prophet whose prophecies were really focusing on the latter days. His prophecies were focusing on the time of the end. Okay, and we have to say the end of what? It's the end of the Old Covenant, the end of Israel as God's people, right? Exclusively God's people. So Daniel puts the second coming in the time of the end, right? So now here is this second point, Matthew 24. We're going to read Matthew chapter 24 from verse 1 to verse 33, right? And we will see that Christ in that chapter, also in Mark 13 and in Luke 21. Let me put them here. They just came to me. Mark 13 and Luke 21. These three chapters, Jesus clearly puts his coming, the coming with the clouds of heaven, the coming into his kingdom, the coming with power. He puts that at the time of the destruction of the temple at Jerusalem and in the apostles' generation. Okay, we'll see it clearly. So we want to go to Matthew chapter 24 and we will start from verse 1. So let's get our Bible up here again. And we begin. You see, the thing is, I believed for 19 years that Jesus' coming would be future to my time. And I believe that not because I actually read what Jesus said in terms of going from verse to verse to verse to verse, but I believed it based on commentaries, from Bible studies, from devotionals, from reading books, listening to pastors and preachers, and watching people on television and YouTube. But I never actually sat down and read the thing myself. And when we did Bible studies, we weren't actually studying the Bible. What we were actually studying was a narrative that said, this is what's going to happen, that's what's going to happen, this is what's going to happen. And then Bible verses were now slotted in to support what the narrative said. But now we are going to actually read what Jesus said, and we'll see if it matches with what the narratives say. Okay, so we're going to begin from verse 1. Matthew 24. And Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him for to show him the buildings of the temple. This is key. So the scene is set. The focus of Matthew 24 is the buildings of the temple at Jerusalem. Okay? And Jesus said unto them, see ye not all these things? What things? Obviously, the buildings of the temple. Okay? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. Okay? And as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came unto him privately, saying, tell us, when shall these things be? What are these things? When will the buildings of the temple be thrown down? When will there be left not one stone upon another? That's these things they're asking. Notice this is the question they're asking. When will the temple at Jerusalem be destroyed? Now, remember, if you have been following my previous studies, you'll remember Daniel chapter 9, verse 26 and 27 talks about the destruction of the temple. Okay? And it puts the destruction of the temple at the end, at the consummation. Okay, and remember, Daniel is an old covenant prophet. So the consummation of the old covenant is when the temple would be destroyed. So they ask, when shall these things be? And when shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the age? The word world here is the word eon. So they were not asking for the end of the globe. They were asking for the end of the age. And which age were they in? They were in the old or the Sinai covenant age. They cannot be asking for the end of the new covenant age, because the new covenant age did not happen until maybe several years later. Okay? They were asking about the end of the age that they were in presently, which was the Sinai covenant age. Okay? So notice now, according to Daniel 9:26 and 27, the temple and the city were to be destroyed at the end of, or the consummation of, the Sinai covenant age. They are familiar with that because Jesus would have taught them the prophecies of Daniel. And so once they heard Jesus say that the temple will be destroyed, then they're asking him, okay, so you're talking about Daniel 9:26. So when will be the consummation? Actually, in the Greek, this term, end of the age, the end of the world, is actually consummation of the age. Let me show it to you in the Berean Bible. Look what it says. What is the sign of your coming and the consummation of the age, right? Again, so they're asking for, when will the Sinai covenant age consummate? When will it end? They're not asking about the end of time. They're not asking for the end of the planet. They're asking, when will the Sinai covenant age end so that we can go into the new covenant age, the age of the Spirit. Okay? So, now why are they linking his coming with the consummation of the age? Because, again, Daniel, what we read in Daniel chapter 7, verse 13, puts the coming in the clouds. It is a latter day sign. It's a latter day prophecy. It's an end of the age prophecy. Daniel is a prophet. His prophecies were to come to pass in the time of the end. Okay? So therefore, they understood that Jesus, his coming with the clouds still had to happen, but it had to happen before the consummation of the age. All right? And we'll see Jesus say it. We'll see it as we go down. So don't, if your mind is a bit confused, it's confused not because of what I'm saying. It's because the narratives are clashing. What you are reading here, you're trying to reconcile it with what you have been told by your denomination. And it's going to cause a bit of confusion. All right? But let's read on, and hopefully it's going to clear up. So remember the question they are asking. The primary question they're asking is concerning the destruction of the temple. Daniel 9, 26 and 27 says that will happen at the consummation, at the end. The disciples are also asking about the consummation of the age, right? So they are in line with Daniel, what Daniel had predicted. So, but let us see about the coming. Daniel 7 had said the coming would also happen, okay, in the end. So, let's see. Let's continue with the King James. Okay? So Jesus is now answering. Jesus answered and said unto them. Okay? So he's saying unto his disciples. So he's answering the question he was asked. When is the temple going to be destroyed? What is going to be the sign of that destruction and of his coming, and also at the end of the age? All of these things are synonymous or contemporary with each other. You know, I was taught that they are separate events. So the temple will be destroyed, and then thousands of years later you will have the coming of Christ and the end of the world. No. All of these things were synonymous. The temple, the destruction of the temple, the end of the age, the coming of Christ, all were happening in the same period of time. If you study the book of Daniel and you apply the covenant prophecy principle, you will understand that. So anyway, Jesus is saying, take heed that no man deceive you, for many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, shall deceive many. And ye, remember he's talking to the disciples, he's telling them, he's giving them the signs that will happen before the temple is destroyed. He says, you shall hear of wars and rumors of wars, and see ye that you be not troubled. So he's not saying, hey, you guys 2,000 years, 3,000 years, 4,000 years later, you're going to hear wars and rumors of wars, and that's a sign of my coming. No, he's telling his disciples, he's telling them privately that they will witness wars and rumors of wars in their time. So, and he told them, be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, and the end is not yet. So they will have wars and rumors of wars before the end of the old covenant age. That's the end he's talking about. The end of, remember they asked him, what are the signs of the end of the age or the consummation of the age, right? So he says, okay, the old covenant is not going to consume yet. Okay, they have to have these wars and rumors of wars. Then he says, nation shall rise up against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There shall be famines, pestilence, earthquakes, diverse places, and so on and so forth. And many of these things, you see them recorded in the book of Acts. We saw famines in the book of Acts. We saw earthquakes in the book of Acts. All of these things were happening during the time of the apostles as the time progressed up to the destruction of the temple, because that was the issue. That was the question they asked. He says, all these are beginning of sorrows. Then they shall deliver you. Who? Who shall they deliver? The apostles. You remember in the book of Acts, they had persecution. In Acts chapter 8, it talks about Saul of Tarsus, how he led the persecution against the Christians. He got letters from the high priest and so on, so that he may imprison some of them and he can kill them and so on. Yeah, so there will be persecution. Jesus told them they will be delivered up to be afflicted. Some shall kill you. You shall be hated of all. And the word nations there is people. You shall be hated by all people, or even tribes. This word could be translated as, let me give you the lexicon for it. It says ethnos, a race, or a tribe. Okay, so it could be talking about not necessarily countries, but it could be talking about the various tribes that existed in the time of the apostles. And then many shall be offended and shall betray one another and shall hate one another. It's talking about the persecution that the early church went through, and how because of that persecution some betrayed one another and so on. And many false prophets shall arise and deceive many. All of these things, you remember the context of the question, when will the temple be destroyed? What is the sign? And Jesus gave them all the signs. These are all the signs leading up to the destruction of the temple and of the end of the old covenant age. He says, because iniquity shall abound, love of many shall wax cold, but he that shall endure to the end. Which end? Is he expecting his disciples to live until the end of the globe? Does he expect them to live 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years until whenever this planet ends? No. The end here is the end of the old covenant age. You can't expect his disciples to live until the end of the world. They are living until the end of the Sinai covenant age. Some of them would have been alive to see the old covenant ended. They would have seen the destruction, the temple destroyed. You'll see it here. He's talking about it. The same shall be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness. Now remember we talked about how the world ended 2,000 years ago. And in that study, we discovered that the King James took 3 different Greek words, oikoumene, cosmos, and aion, which are totally different in their meanings, and translated all 3 of them as world. So do you know which world is speaking of here? Is it the cosmos? Is it the eon? Or is it the oikoumene? Do you know? Well, let me show it to you in our lexicon. It is the word oikoumene. It is talking about the Roman Empire. This is wherever Israel lived. The diaspora plus Jerusalem and Judea, which at that time was under the control of Rome. So the oikoumene was the Roman Empire. And remember, the gospel was supposed to be preached to Israel. He says, go ye not to the Samaritans nor the way of the Gentiles, but go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel and proclaim to them that the kingdom of God is near, the kingdom of heaven is near. So that's the gospel of the kingdom. Daniel chapter 2, you remember Daniel chapter 2 talked about the kingdom of heaven. So the kingdom of heaven was an old covenant promise. And so the kingdom of heaven had to be established before the old covenant ended. There you go again with the covenant principle, the covenant prophecy principle. All prophecies made within the old covenant had to come to pass before the old covenant ended. So that is why they were preaching the gospel of the kingdom of heaven, which Daniel chapter 2 prophesied of. And it was here coming to pass. Okay? So preached in all the world, preached in all of the Roman Empire for a witness unto all nations. And here we do have the word ethnos again, which could mean people or tribes. And then shall the end come. Which end? Remember they asked in chapter 3, what shall be the sign of the end of the world, which is the end of the age, the eon. King James took the word eon, translated as world. Come down here, they took the word oikoumene, translated as world. So you don't know. You don't know what you're reading. Okay? You don't know what you're reading. But down here, it is the Roman Empire. In verse 3, it is the age. So that is what they were asking. When shall the end of the age come? Well, he says when the gospel of the kingdom has been preached to all of the diaspora. Because you remember, the promise was made to Israel. So the gospel had to be preached to Israel to let them know that the promise is coming true. All right. So let's continue. Verse 15, when you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet. Again, Daniel talked about the abomination of desolation. He's an old covenant prophet. So the abomination of desolation had to come to pass before the old covenant ended. Now we are still hearing people talking about, oh yeah, the abomination of desolation happened in 1798 or something like that. Or some people say it still have to happen, you know. But Jesus' understanding was the abomination of desolation would be seen by his disciples. He says, when you, meaning the disciples who asked him privately, shall see the abomination of desolation, spoken of Daniel, stand where? In the holy place, in the temple. How can we have an abomination of desolation today when there is no temple? The abomination was to stand in the holy place of the Jerusalem temple, because look, it says, then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. So the abomination of desolation would happen in Judea, in the holy place, which is the temple, which was in Judea, which was in Jerusalem. How are you going to have that happen now? How are you going to have that happen after the end of the Old Covenant? Because the Old Covenant ended with the destruction of the temple. And this is why many Christians believe that the Jews have to build a third temple, and they're sending the money over to Israel to finance the Orthodox Jews and these Messianic Jews to rebuild a third temple and to start up sacrifices and offerings again. And they're trying to find descendants of Levi to operate as high priests. Because they don't understand that the covenant ended. Okay, so let's continue. So all of these things, the setting of Matthew 24 is Jerusalem. That's the setting. So that's why Jesus says, let them which be in Judea flee to the mountains. The setting is Judea, it's Jerusalem. Let him which is on the housetop not come down and take anything out of his house. House where? House in Judea. Not house in America, not house in USA, not house in the Caribbean, not house in Europe, house in Jerusalem, in Judea. That's the context of what Jesus is talking about. Neither let him which is in the field return back to take his clothes. As a matter of fact, on the house stop gives you a clue that it's also in Jerusalem, because in Jerusalem, you could have gone on your house stop because it was a solid roof and a flat roof. Up there is where they put their various grains to dry in the sun and so on. Okay? We don't have those kind of roofs now. How can we go up on our house roof? We're gonna slide off because our house roofs are gabled. So you see, once you put the context there, you realize Jesus is not talking about 2,000 years later. He's not talking about nations like, what we may call the Gentile nations. He's talking about Jerusalem. Okay? So anyway, verse 19. And woe to them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days. But pray ye that your flight be not in the winter night, neither on the Sabbath day. Why? Because on the Sabbath day, the gates were closed. We don't live in that scenario anymore. On the Sabbath day, we can take our car and we can drive anywhere we want. Nobody's going to stop us. But in Jerusalem, the gates were shut on the Sabbath day, so you can't have an ease of flight. Okay? For then, this word, then is the Greek word tote. Let me show it to you. Right, so here's the Greek word, tote. It says, when, at the time that. Okay? So it is at that time this thing will happen. So remember, we're still in the same context. Go back to the Bible. We are still in the same context leading up to the destruction of the temple at Jerusalem. And so Jesus says, at that time, when you have the abomination of desolation. Okay? So that's the last thing we read that will happen. The abomination of desolation and the fleeing of Judea and Jerusalem. Not fleeing on the Sabbath day. He says, for at that time, at the time when you have the abomination of desolation in the temple at Jerusalem, shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. So Jesus is saying, well, watch, you see the tribulation that will happen at the time of the abomination of desolation in Jerusalem, in the Jerusalem temple. That tribulation will be one which will never happen again. So how is it people are saying, well, we are waiting for the time of trouble, of Jacob's trouble, and we're waiting for the great tribulation spoken of by Jesus in Matthew 24. And Jesus says, well, look, that tribulation that I was speaking about happened at the time leading up to the destruction of the temple at Jerusalem, and it's not going to happen again. You see, once you let Jesus speak, if people would just let Jesus speak and not try to twist his words and fit them into some narrative which tells you, this thing is happening thousands of years later. If we take out our presuppositions that we come to the Bible with and just allow Jesus to speak, we would be much better off. So he says, for then, tote, at that time, when you have the abomination of desolation in Jerusalem, you're going to have a great tribulation, and it will never happen again. And verse 22 says, for except those days. Which days? The same days with the great tribulation at the time of the abomination of desolation, which would occur in Jerusalem at the time Jesus was saying it. Okay? Those are the days he's talking about. Except those days should be shortened, there should be no flesh saved. So he's talking about his disciples. He says, look, this thing will be so terrible, it will wipe out even the disciples and the apostles. But for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. And then here we have the word again, then, tote, at that time. Right? At that time, let's look at it again. Lexicon. Tote. At the time that. At that time. Okay? So what time are we talking about? We're still in the same time. still in the time leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem. If any man shall say unto you, Lo, here is Christ, or there, believe it not. For there shall be false Christs, false prophets, which shall show great signs and wonders. Insomuch, if it were possible, they shall deceive the very elect. Who was he talking about? The very elect were Israel, who had been chosen by the Spirit of God. Those who had been sealed with the Spirit of God. Those were the very elect. Those whom had been chosen by the Spirit, like the 12 disciples, and those who were baptized with the Spirit and being baptized by the Holy Spirit as the apostles' ministry bore fruit. Those were the elect he was talking about. He says, behold, I have told you. Who is the you he was speaking to? Privately, the disciples. Verse 26, wherefore I say unto you, wherefore if they shall say unto you, behold, he is in the desert, go not forth, behold, he is in the chambers, believe it not. All of this was happening leading up to the time of the destruction of Jerusalem. For as the lightning cometh out of the east and shineth unto the west, so shall the coming of the Son of Man be. Here we have the nature of the coming of the Son of Man, which I said we will not deal with at this time. We're going to look at the nature in a subsequent study. All right, so I'm just going to pass this over. For wheresoever the carcass is, there the eagles shall be gathered together. So he's talking about a great slaughter that will happen. That's why you have these eagles or these birds of prey, right? He's talking about a great slaughter. He was talking about the time when the Romans besieged Jerusalem, okay? And they were, the Jews began to slaughter one another. They had civil war going on in there. The various factions of the Jews began to fight one another because, remember, they were running out of food, and so they had to, they began to form in factions and take food from one another and kill one another. And then afterwards, when the Romans came in, they were all weakened. The Jews were all weakened because they were so weak from not having food, and the Romans slaughtered them. Right? That's what it's talking about, a great slaughter. The eagles shall be gathered together. And it says immediately, not 2,000 years later or 3,000 years later or 4,000 years later. It's amazing to me how Christians butcher the language. You know, here Jesus is saying immediately after they have that slaughter in Jerusalem, the sun shall be darkened, the moon shall not give her light, the stars shall fall from heaven, the powers of heaven shall be shaken. And these are languages which are used, borrowed from the Old Testament, where the prophets, whenever they're talking about in like a change in government or one kingdom falling to set up another kingdom, these are the kind of language that they used, right? The powers of heaven, the leaders that are governing, these were called the powers of heaven, okay? But anyway, look at verse 30, and then, same word, 30. Let's go back again. At that time, right? So we're still in the context. We are still in the context of the slaughter at Jerusalem, the great tribulation, the abomination of desolation, fleeing out of Jerusalem. We're still in that context. We're still in that scenario. And Jesus says, at that time shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. And then shall all the tribes of the earth, and the word earth here is land. Let me show it to you. Lexicon, right? It is a region or a solid part of the whole earthly globe, right? It's not the entire planet. It's a region. It is the Holy Land. It is talking about Jerusalem, right? Who are the tribes of the land? Israel, okay? So let's go back to the Bible now. So, all the tribes of the land shall mourn. They shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven. When? At that time. When you have the slaughter at Jerusalem, when you have the abomination of abomination of desolation, or the abomination that brings desolation in Jerusalem. At that time, you have the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven. Yes, he had to come at that time because it was prophesied in Daniel 7:13, which Daniel is an old covenant prophet. So he had to come before the covenant end. Right? And he shall send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet. They shall gather together his elect from the four winds and from one end of heaven to another. Now learn a parable of the fig tree. When his branch is yet tender and putteth forth leaves, you know that summer is nigh. So likewise, when you shall see all these things. What are all these things? Huh? What are all these things? When his disciples saw the false prophets, when they saw the abomination of desolation, when they saw the tribulation of the Jews, when they see all of those things, know that it is near, even at the door. What is at the door? The destruction of Jerusalem and its temple. That was the subject of the entire chapter. Now look at verse 34. Verily, what does this word verily mean? Let's put it up on the lexicon. It means amen, firm, trustworthy, surely. So Jesus is saying, I'm not lying. Jesus is saying, you can take my word to the bank. Do not bother with what your denomination tell you. Do not bother with what your Bible commentary tells you. Do not bother with what your prophet tells you. Do not bother with what your lesson study tells you. Do not bother with what the preacher tells you. Do not bother with whosoever has a different understanding than what Jesus is presenting here. Don't listen to it, because I'm verily saying unto you, this generation, he didn't say that generation thousands of years later, or 2,000 or 3,000 or millennia later. No, he says, this generation to whom I am talking to shall not pass till all these things. Again, what are all these things? What are all these things? Destruction of Jerusalem, the false prophets, the wars, the rumors of wars, the false Christ, the abomination of desolation in the temple at Jerusalem, the fleeing, the persecution, the tribulation, the coming of the Son of Man. This generation shall not pass till all those things be fulfilled. That was what Jesus' teaching was.